What's up, guys? It's Fullsnack Developer here, and today we're getting into part 4 of Intro to Web Development. So in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about connecting in our style sheets and looking at some attributes, as well as talking about some file structuring as well. So where we left off from our last tutorial is we have a working navigation. We're able to click through our links here in our nav and change the pages accordingly. We're going to get right into it right off the hop. I'm going to open up our HTTP folder here, which is where we have our website main directory. And I'm going to start to flesh out our project, a file system, before we get into, connecting our different code files. So in here, I'm just going to switch the layout here. In here we have our main HTML pages in our main directory. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it Assets. Now, there are many different ways to set up your project, but this is the way that I learned, and I think it works really well. So if you have a different way of doing it and it works for you, awesome. This is the way I like to do it. So I create an Assets folder. And I create some other folders in there, one of them being obviously CSS. I'm going to put a couple other folders in there that we're going to use in later tutorials, not necessarily this one, but just to show the file structure, I'm going to throw them in now. So JS stands for JavaScript, fonts folder in case we want to put in some custom fonts, and then let's just say image for our images. So basically I'll keep all non, like HTML files, in the assets folder, and then that's how I reference them, and I keep all the main pages, in the main directory here. So let's get into this. CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So basically, CSS really is what makes, everything look pretty. You can see here we've got our basic HTML, which is really like the bones of it, the bones and the meat, because this is where your content and initial layout. But it's really the CSS that wraps it all up and makes it look pretty. So we're gonna be covering three main attributes of CSS. There are a pile of them, and it's gonna take a couple tutorials to get through it all. But we're gonna first start with connecting the file, and then we're gonna get into those three main attributes and really explaining them and fleshing them out, because they're really the most used. Like I talked about in previous tutorials, is that the head tag here hosts meta information about the website that doesn't necessarily display in the viewable browser here, but it's still very important. So the example was this title tag here changes the name of the tab up there. So this is where we're going to link in our style sheet. So we're going to put the link attribute here. And it has the link element, and it has two attributes here. One is the rel, which stands for relationship, and the other one is our hypertext reference. So we've seen this attribute before down here in our A tag. So it's going to work essentially the same way. Here we link to an HTML file, but now up here we're going to link to our style sheet. And that's the reasoning for the other attribute, is basically saying the relationship of the file that we're linking is a style sheet. You can use link for other things, but it's mainly used for style sheets. So we're going to want to connect this to a file, but we don't have a file yet. So we're going to go ahead and create a new file here. I'm just going to save it into our CSS folder here, and I'm going to call it styles.css. So in here, we now have a blank file, and I'm just going to put styles here. I'm just going to command / which just comments it out, which means that this bit of code has no effect on our HTML. So this is where we are going to write our CSS. But first, let's go ahead and connect our style sheet here. So now that we have that CSS file, we're going to navigate to that path. So just like in our A tag, we have the /, which brings us to the parent directory. Then we're going to say assets /CSS /style.css. So that is going to be the exact path right here to our style sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. As you noticed here, I've actually dragged my project folder into Sublime here, and it's shown me the files and a way to navigate my directories here. All you have to do to get this is just go over to your main directory folder, click it, drag it, and just drop it on top of Sublime Text and or whatever text editor you're using, but drop it in there and it should pop up like this. Easier navigation. Okay, so right now we have our style sheet connected in here. We can go ahead and refresh here. I will make note of this, that we are working in the index HTML, so our other two pages do not have a link to the style sheet. So we're going to go ahead and just copy this and paste it into all three pages, just so there isn't any confusion if we click through the links and suddenly the pages is changing. So all three of our pages have this link to the style sheet. One thing I will note is you can actually have different style sheets. Say I called this home.css and I wanted to have very specific styling for the home page, and then very different styling for the contact page, and I changed this to contact. I'm not going to do that. We're just going to use all the same style sheet, but you can use different style sheets. So all right, let's start writing some CSS. So I said we were going to cover three main attributes. But before we get into that, we have to talk about IDs and classes. Now this is going to be a huge thing. This is the huge connector between HTML and CSS. So the way that CSS communicates with HTML is through selectors. So I'm going to write a selector here, and I'm going to say div, and then I'm going to put curly brackets, and then inside here, this is where I would write my attributes. So I'm just going to say margin 0, margin 0, that's margin 0, and padding 0. It's automatically. There we go. Okay, so here we have an attribute and a value. So this is the attribute of margin, and we're giving it a value of 0. So that's how all attributes work. You give them, they'll have a name, and then you give it a specific value. And there's a lot of different values that you can give. We'll get into those once we start fleshing them out. But right now we're talking about selectors. So what this does actually is we've given it the selector of div. So in our HTML here, you can see that we have this div tag down here, and it looks like that's the only div in here. So this CSS would correspond to this element, and because it's the only div element, that this would be the only thing that is affected. But let's say that we had another div down here, and inside it let's put some text there. Actually, let's throw that in a p tag. There's some dummy text in p, and now p stands for paragraph. This is an HTML tag. and it's just basically for just standard paragraph text. So we're gonna save that. Go over here and refresh, and now our dummy text is showing up. So now that we have two divs, we have two div elements. Now, our CSS just says divs. It's selecting, this selector selects all elements in our HTML that correspond to this tag. So it would look at the HTML, it would say, okay, we have a div here, we're going to apply these styles to this div, and then it would come down here and say, oh, there's another div, we will apply the styles to this div. So it works for all, and it would continue down as many divs as you have. It works that way. Now, say we want to treat this div differently from this one. Well, we need a way to specify which one's which. So this is where we're going to start talking about something called ID. So we can give the div element an ID, a unique identifier that will help us select just this div to style. So if we say in this div, let's call this page heading. I'm going to go ahead and save that now. I'm going to refresh, and nothing has happened, obviously, but now we have a way to specify between these two divs. We can also do the same thing here. We can give this an ID of, let's say, page content, let's say. Go ahead and save that. Now we have unique identifiers for both these divs. So when we go into the CSS, this will still, it'll go through, it will still select saying, hey, this is a div, we'll apply the styles to the same. We can now specify between these with a hashtag, hashtag page, let's say heading. Now, this hashtag basically is a way to say ID in CSS. So we say find a div with the ID of page heading and give it these these stylings. So it would go into the index here. It would say, okay, here's a div with the ID of page heading, and apply the styles to this particular element. So that, in a nutshell, is how CSS works with HTML. We could do the same thing by, let's just copy and paste this and say div page with the ID of page content, and say we wanted to give it 40 pixels. So we're going to get into explaining what margin padding are here in just a second, but you can see now this actually moved because we gave the margin of value for page content, but not for page heading. So if we pop open our console here, I'll drag it over here, we can see now that we have a div here with the ID of page heading, page content. Now if we select this, you'll see down here in the element styles, this now has a margin of 40, and we gave that based off of our selector here. So we can see it even tells us on on style.css, our file, on line 8, this is where these attributes are given. So if we look back over here on line 8, these styles are given. So that's selecting elements individually. Now we're going to get into something. This concept was a little hard for me to grasp when I started. I'm going to do my best to explain it here, and hopefully this will be maybe a little less difficult to understand. But IDs help select divs individually. You should never use an ID twice because obviously it's a unique identifier to this particular element. So I would never want to use this, down on this div as well. This would be bad. because now it's looking for one specific element, and now there's two, so that's bad etiquette. If you want to apply the same styles to two elements, two or more, you're going to use something called a class. Class is an attribute that you are able to give as many elements as you'd like. So let's say I'm going to call this one, a class of more padding. Now I could copy this and I could apply it to the page content. So say over in our style sheet, let's flip back over to our style sheet. I have something called let's say, well, we just gave it the class of more padding. Now in the CSS here, you'll notice that instead of using a hashtag, I'm using a period. In CSS, a period is classified as a class. It's basically like here we're saying, a div with the hashtag, with the ID, a div with the ID, that's what the hashtag stands for, of said value. Now that we're using class, we say div with the class. That's what the period stands for, of said value. So that's the difference. Now, I should also add that right now we're saying specifically to div elements. We're being very specific to div elements here. What you can do, and what's often used, is you don't actually have to specify the type of element you're using. So if I say it's gonna still work exactly the same, because now we're basically saying any element that has an ID of this value will get these properties. Any element with a class. So here we've added it to divs, but we could also use this class, say, on the header, which isn't a div element, but we can still use the class element or ID if we wanted to give it an ID. We could do that as well, but we're giving it a class here, and it can go across any type of element. So let's save this. Let's go over here, and let's give padding 100. Let's really show it, 100 pixels. I'm going to get into explaining the values that you can give these attributes and how they work, but for now we're just talking about the naming corresponding. So now that we have that saved, we're going to refresh here, and you'll see things have moved around a bunch. So let's take a look at what happened. You can see here now, because I gave this a class of more padding, the class was given padding 100. But now you'll notice, if you notice that we had put it on the header. We gave page heading. We gave it the class of more padding, as well as page content, the class of heading. Now you might be wondering, well, why didn't they move around a lot? Well, this is where cascading style sheets gets its name, cascading. So let's go back and take a look here. You'll see that we're being specific with these values here. So we're saying identifier with the page heading. You'll see here that they actually get the value of padding, but then it's crossed out here because there's another value that's overriding it because it's technically more specific. Now, this is an interesting concept to grasp. Styling will always, CSS, the styling will always be overwritten by a selector that is more specific. So what that means is class it is a general identifier. It can be used across many different elements, whereas an ID is specific to one element. Therefore, these properties, as you can see here, margin 0 and padding 0, the padding 0 overwrites the padding 100. So if I came up here and let's say I deleted the padding from this one and I deleted the padding from this one, if we save this and refresh, you'll see now that they have they've jumped and they've gotten the value from more padding. So that that is just that is how CSS works. The more specific you are about an element, the values will get overwritten. Now, while we're on the train of cascading styling, I'm going to just quickly show you how that can work in a different way. So let's say I have, you wouldn't really do this, but I'm just showing you how things are overwritten. Say you have, maybe it's a different class name, but another selector that's giving properties to a certain element, and we say padding, let's get 30 pixels. So if we save that now, we refresh, you'll see now that the value is a lot less. So if we go in here, select the let's say the header here, it has the class of more padding, and you'll see down here in the styling, the padding 100 was overwritten by padding 30. Now, that is because they both have the same specifics. They're both the exact same specificity, but because this one is lowered down, because CSS is read procedurally by default, this will overwrite this. So if I cut this and I move it above that and save and refresh, you'll see that now again we're back to having padding 100 be the top value and padding 30 is overwritten. And that's because, like I said before, it's procedural. So this one is written first, and then this one comes along and says, "Oh, I have the exact same specificity as this one, but I'm further along here, so I'm just going to overwrite this and use these values." So that is how cascading style sheets works. That's how they were designed to, so that you are able to really use that to your advantage. We'll get into that more in later tutorials, but that is how it works. So there can be some frustration on like, why is this not styling properly? It often comes down to a matter of one element or CSS selector that is more specific, that is overriding a different selector and property, and it can get confusing. So it's important to have good structured and commented CSS, so that you're not banging your head against the wall when it comes to fixing a problem. So that is ID, the ID and class. So now let's get into more about the properties of what we can give, what properties we can write in our CSS and give to our selectors here. So I'm just going to remove more padding because that was just an example, and we're going to talk. Here we go. More about padding and margin. So you might have been able to figure it out a little bit there from what we had been working on just by throwing in some values in here, but we're really going to flesh it out now. So for this part, I'm just going to flip over here to Illustrator just to show you kind of a visual of the differences between margin and padding. So like I was saying before, and like I say in earlier tutorials, the elements are like boxes. So I always imagine like getting a package in the mail. That's always fun. So you've got this box, and say you want to put something inside of it. but you don't want it to get, banged around, and you don't want it to touch the edge. So you add padding. So let's this is the box. Let's make it a brown color here just to show. And now we want to put some padding on the inside. So we're gonna put some, let's say, some bubble wrap here, and I'm just gonna quickly, there we go. And let's make the bubble wrap blue. And so now you can see the blue, we're gonna say, is our bubble wrap. And so inside of our box, and technically, let's just imagine that this is inside the box. This is now going to keep our content or whatever, let's say some, can I just stretch it? Oh, there we go. So say this is our content that we want to put in the box. It's now got this padding to keep it away from the wall of the box here. So padding works on the inside of the box, whereas margin would be like wrapping the whole box in more bubble wrap, So this basically keeps away other boxes. So if we had another box that wanted to come bump into this one, it would get stopped by the margin, because that's how the relationship would work. It can't come any closer. It can't come any closer to the box. I will point out that if this box, let's go over here and push it behind. If this box has its own margin, what happens is they cancel each other out. Margins will look at other margins and say, oh, we're just spacing in between elements. That's fine to merge those two. So you'll often see that happen. That won't happen with padding because it's on the inside of the box, and the box will always maintain its integrity. But margins will allow the overlap. It will always go to the greatest one. So say this one had a lot more margin here. This one would get stopped there. You can see they lined up. It would stop there and overlap as much as this larger margin would allow. So that's just a little tip about margining. And what happens also, I'll just get rid of this other one. What also happens with padding is the more padding that you give the element, the box will expand to allow the content its original form, unless you give it a width. So if you increase the padding, it will increase the size of the box. That's when my analogy breaks with the whole package and everything. So hopefully this visual demonstration gave you a little better idea of how it's going to work. We're going to flip back over into into our code here, and we're going to start seeing some firsthand examples of that. So that's the relationship between padding and margining. So our header text here, we have our selector, and we're giving it a value of 0 right now. So if we pop over here into our developer tool and we select this, this div here, you can see that margin 0. If we click this down arrow, you'll see that margin has 4 values actually. So when we write margin 0, what actually gets written to the browser is margin top 0, margin right 0, bottom 0, left 0. So it always works starting at the top and going around counterclockwise. So this is often for a lot of CSS values. It starts at the top and then moves its way around clockwise. So because the value that we gave is margin 0, it sets all of the values to 0. Therefore, our element has 0 margining on all sides. So what we can do actually is we can say, let's say we say 20, if we say 20 pixels here, oh, that says 2. If we say 20 pixels, you'll see if we pop back into our console tools here, you'll see that now margin, it sets all of the values to 20. So what we can do is there's several different ways of doing this. What we could do, and which is perfectly fine, it works, is to actually write out all those values. So say margin top. I'm just going to duplicate this and say right, bottom, and left. That is the exact same thing. Nothing's going to change. This is totally fine, but as you can see, it's 4 lines of code where we can write just margin 20 pixels. It'll do it all the way around. And that's a lot easier and better way of doing it. Excuse me. So what we can do now is if we want to set specific values for each side of the margin, we can do that here. Say we set this one to 40 and we set this one to 1 and we set this to 5 pixels. We save that, we refresh, and now if we go over into our dev tools, you'll see now that each side has a different value here. I'll stretch this out a little bit. And bump it up here. Each property now has that specific value. So margin top, referring to the above the element, to the right, pretty self-explanatory all the way around. So this is one way of writing it. Now this is definitely not always efficient. Sometimes it's necessary to use these elements on their own for different reasons. But for this purpose, I'm going to show you how to write it in one line. So again, we're going to go back to writing margin like this, but to get this exact same the same output, what we would do is we would write the values in the exact same order going around clockwise. So this would be top here, right, bottom, and then left. So we delete these and we save that. We go back over here and we refresh. We now still have the exact same values, but we've written it in one line. Now, right now we're writing all of these values out, each one specifically. But say we want to have 20 pixels on the top and 20 pixels on the bottom, and then 40 pixels on the left and right. So we'll save that. You'll see here that we have 20 margin on the top and bottom, and then 40 on the sides. Now, what we can do now is, because we're mirroring the top and the bottom and the left and the right, we can actually get rid of these two values. And it's going to have the exact same effect. We refresh and you see that everything stays the exact same. That's because when you give margin two values, what it does basically is it says, okay, the top is 20 and right is 40, but we don't have a value for the bottom. So what it does is it mirrors the corresponding, the opposite value. So if the top is 20, the bottom will be 20, and same goes for, we don't have a value for this one. We'll give it the right value as the left value. So that's essentially what happens. You can actually do this with 3 values as well. So say we have the top value is 20, the right as 40, and say we wanted more padding on the bottom, let's say 30 pixels. Now we'll save this, and you'll come over here and you'll see that now what happens with these values is the top's like, okay, we want 20 pixels on the top, we want 40 pixels on the right. Now on the bottom, you see we have a third value, so it's like, okay, 30 pixels on the bottom. Now we get to where the fourth value would be. It says, oh, we don't have a value. Well, we're going to mirror the right. So that's the the three, what was that, like the four different ways essentially you can write a margin, and the same applies for padding. So these are the four different ways that you can write margin and padding values. You can have one where it would go all the way around. You can have two where both are mirrored. You can have three where the top and the bottom are specific, and then the right and left are mirrored. And then as well as the four values where each side is given specific values. So the exact same apply for the padding. So if we go to our content and we go padding, 20 pixels, 40 pixels, 30 pixels, it's going to be the exact same principle. If we come over to our developers tool, if you want to get that, I'm on a Mac and I'm going Command-Alt-C to pull up the developers tool. Also, I believe it's Command-I for inspect, or right-click and inspect for most browsers. So if we go here to our content page, you'll see now that padding shows up. I'm in Chrome here. Padding shows up as green. The blue is the element itself, and the orange is the margin. So that's just in Chrome. So if we go to our page content here, you'll see that just like the margin, you can drop it. It starts at the top, working its way counterclockwise, and the value mirroring works the exact same. Now, I'm going to give an example of what I was talking about when I was doing the sample in Illustrator. I'm going to just quickly throw out a value called background. Now, this is an attribute that also can have a lot of properties. I'm not going to flesh this one out super detailed, but basically we're going to set the background to, let's say, blue. So if we refresh, you see now that this element has a background of blue, but like I was saying before, in this Illustrator file I got open here, I'll shrink that down a bit, that the padding expands the box. So when we added the padding to the content, we were expanding the size of the box. So when we gave the box a background of blue, it included the padding as part of the box. Now, I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to give the background blue to our header element, which is using margin rather than padding, and you'll see what happens. Just like in our example here, this black being the margin, it's not included in the box, and in this case, it's the element. So if we flip back over here, you'll see that to our browser, our margin is not included in the box. So when we give it a value, the element a background value of blue, it does not include the padded or the margined area. So this really demonstrates what I was talking about before. You can see here firsthand that inside this box, we've given it padding on the inside, which keeps the edge of the box away from this paragraph that we've thrown in there, and the heading has given it spaced away from another element. So to demonstrate what I was talking about before about overlapping, let's go ahead and give page content. Oh, sorry. In our code here, page content, a margin value. Let's give it a margin. Let's say margin top of what do we give this one? 30, well, let's say 20 pixels. And we save, we refresh. Now you notice nothing happened. Now this is because you can see here that our margin for our page element overlapped our header or our heading margin. So they pushed it, each other far enough away based off of the page heading, based off of which margin was greater. So let's go back and give page content a greater margin than the page heading, and you'll see here that it has pushed it farther away because now the page content had a larger margin. You can see here it has a margin of 60, and if you flip between the two, you'll see how they overlap like that. It's greater than the page heading. So that's how margin works. But if we give padding, let's just give it a big old value of 60 pixels. If we increase the value of the padding, all it does is just make the element larger. It doesn't affect the distance between the two elements because it's just changing the size and the inside all contained within the element. So that is padding and margin in a nutshell. I'm going to throw one more CSS attribute in here, width. Now I don't want to overwhelm you guys, so this is already going to be this has already been a big learning curve if you're just starting in CSS, and I don't want to drag this tutorial too long, but this will be the last attribute that I'm going to be covering in this tutorial. There'll definitely be more. CSS is a huge topic. So what width is you can imagine, is setting the size of these boxes. So let's get right to it, and let's change the heading width. So the attribute is width, and then what you could do is give it a value of, let's say, 100 and 1200 pixels. That's what px stands for, pixels. There are a bunch of different types of value like that you can give. Some include rem, or view width, or view height, or even percentage. I can go into what all those mean in more detail later, but for now we're just going to be using pixels for simplicity. But we will definitely cover different types of values that you can get into. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. We're going to see what happens. And as you can see here, it stopped the element way back here. Before, it was just spanning the whole browser, and now that we give it a specific value, it's cutting the element off. Now, it's cutting the element off at that size, and then adding margin around it. Now, let's see what happens. And let's just size this down so that we can see better. Let's say 800 pixels, and just, yeah, okay. So that's really noticeable. Let's give the page content the same width and see what happens. Now, what you'll see here is, let's just open up our console. Our console, and take a look at what's happening here. So, our page content is given the value, the inside value. So this is a bit interesting. The element still is within the box. The padding is added on. So we can set the width of an element, and so basically it sets the width and then reads, okay, it's got padding. We put the we stuff in the bubble wrap, and it expands the entire element. Whereas when we're doing our when we're using margining, the margining is added afterwards also, but because it's not affecting the actual size of the box, the width stays 800 pixels exactly, and then just moved by the margin. So that's the type of relationship. These both have the same width, the same set width, but margin and padding react to them differently, just based off the way the relationship between CSS and HTML. So that is something to keep in mind if we wanted to make them both the exact same width. So say I'm just going to give these just a set value, so it's a little easier to do the numbers. So if we wanted to have them exactly the same width, what we'd have to do is say, because we've set the width to 800, but then we have a padding of 60 all the way around, 60 on this side, 60 on this side, that's 120. So really, if including the padding, this would equal, what would that, 800 plus 120 is 920. So there you go. 920. So really, the width of this element looks like, if we're basing it off the blue, 920 pixels. So we could either say, 920 pixels there. Go ahead and save that. We could refresh, and now, let's go ahead and give margin there. Oh, did I give it? 40. Sorry, 40 pixels. There we go. Okay, so they have the same margining, so they're lining up here. Now they look the exact same size, but they have different widths, essentially, because you have to account for the fact that padding is added on after the width. So we could do that, or we could do the opposite of 800, and then set the width to 680. We refresh, and you'll see here now this is 100 pixels wide, and then we account for the opposite. So that is the width attribute. We can talk. I'm going to talk about just the fact that you can also add a percent value in here, because that often refers to width, and when you get into grid and responsive design, this comes into play a lot. So if we set the value to 100%, it's going to set the width to 100% of the browser. Now you'll see here I've got side scrolling, and side scrolling is usually not the best thing when you're doing when you're building a website, unless you're doing something really special. You really don't want to have them, if they're scrolling up and down and left and right, it gets really weird. You do not want this. Now, why is this happening if we set the width to 100%? Well, it's because of the margining. So what happens is the CSS looks at 100% of the browser. It's like, okay, from this edge to this edge, which in this case is right up there, was like 1475. So that's what it sets the width of the element to, but then it says, oh, we got this margin, so let's throw the margin on there, and that's the that's the difference in there. So if we took off the margin, and then we might have to actually take off the padding as well. So both are affecting, like we talked about before, both affect the width. So if we take both of those off, you'll see now that it spans the entire width. Now, I will add that browsers do have a bunch of preset style sheets. So you'll see here the margin just inherently from the browser itself will have a value of margin 8 pixels. Now, every browser is different, so What often what a lot of people do is have a reset, a reset style sheet which clears everything out to equal absolutely nothing. What I often do is, and I'll quickly show you this. We're gonna get into more selectors in later tutorials, but in this one, I'm just gonna show you what this one does. Now, you're wondering, what is that asterisk? What is that? What does that select? And that's a great question. The star selector means select everything. It's saying wildcard. It says it doesn't matter what it is, take every element and set everything to margin 0, padding 0. Now I will add that I added this at the top because, like we said before, cascading style sheets, this is going to get overwritten by elements that are more specific. This is incredibly general. It's saying everything, and it's at the top of our style sheet. So obviously it's going to get overwritten, but you'll see now that all of these values that had preset values by the browser have now gone away, and we're bumping right up to the edge. So when we say the width is 100%, it truly is 100% of the width. So there's a lot more to it. I think this is a good length to cut the tutorial here, but there's going to be a lot more to talk about CSS in the tutorials to come. But I think this has given you the groundwork for naming and selecting our elements and getting the basics of margin, padding, and of width to get you started. So we're going to talk more, a lot more about CSS in tutorials to come, and we're going to get even deeper. But this is good groundwork to get out of the way right off the hop. So I will see you guys in the next tutorials.